and let Nikki really set the tone for the webinar today. Nikki Myers-Lim is the Executive Director of the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center. She's been a valued CAM member since 2014, so for 5 years she's been on CAM's board. She's been an active member of our Government Relations Committee, and she was our co-chair of our Government Relations Committee for a couple of years, and a featured and valued speaker at our CAM conference. This presentation was presented at the California Association Museums Conference in San Francisco in February of this year, of 2019. And when we received the evaluation results from the conference, we asked people what their favorite or what most impactful sessions were that they experienced at the conference. And this was by far the one that everybody mentioned, that it really had an impact on how they thought about their museum and their museum work. As a matter of fact, one of the CAM conference participants mentioned that this should be required training for every history museum worker. So that really resonated with us, and so we invited Nikki, who organized this session for the conference, and her fellow presenters to do this as an encore presentation electronically with a webinar, so that we can share it with other museum professionals that weren't at the conference. So that's all that I really want to say to kind of set the tone, and I pass it off the presentation to Nikki, and I look forward to hearing what all of our speakers have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. So when I thought about doing this presentation, I thought of this image, and so that's why it's our #1 image. But it really illustrates what happens when Native people get frustrated with efforts to decolonize. And this is a photo of a statue that used to be Father Sarah in response to the canonization of Father Sarah, and the events that happened around that time when that occurred. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to pull together a group of Native experts on the topic, and I think that in terms of decolonization, it can mean a lot of different things. But I think that it's very important that as Native people, we take the lead on defining and establishing what some of the best practices are in decolonization efforts. And so today we have Dr. Jolie Proudfit from the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center in San Marcos, who also works as a Native American media expert, and Alexis Bunten from Bioneers Indigeneity program. My mouth is hard to say all of these things really fast, so I'm going to be drinking water throughout this presentation. And I work with Alexis quite a bit on Native youth programming and the environmental justice programming that goes on in Bioneers. And Dr. Kouslaa Kessler-Mata from the University of San Francisco, who is the chair of the political science department. Next slide. And so I think that it's really critical when we have a discussion about decolonization that we define genocide and violence. And this is a UN definition of genocide, but the next slide shows more of the details that that are critical to the decolonization process. I like to use these 8 stages of genocide in comparing and contrasting Native American history and genocides that happen all over the world. But I think that it's really important to go through and recognize the things that happen, especially in California history, that furthered the efforts of genocide. And one of the main points that I always make when I have this discussion is that we're still in the 8th stage of denial when it comes to genocide, because we don't tell the truth, we don't acknowledge the truth, we don't empower Indigenous people, we rather blame them for the things that happen. And, you know, we use erasure to kind of deny their opinions in existence. But also stage 7, extermination, is really critical when we're thinking about museums, because we have to look at how Native American culture was collected, and how it's housed in museums and the legacy of that. And there was a recent report that was done at UC Berkeley looking at collections and archives. And there's a whole section on there on salvage science and the efforts of Alfred Kroeber to, and his scientists to go out and collect Native culture in a way that salvaged it. And that doesn't speak to living, vibrant, dynamic cultures. That speaks to holding Native culture in a time capsule. And they also talk about the efforts during salvage science that they had no interest in talking to Native people about the impacts of colonization at the time that they were collecting these things. They were basically just collecting them to freeze them in time. And so when we look at reviewing our collections records and things that are in museums, it's really difficult because everything comes through this very colonized lens. You know, often, and I know everyone else on the panel, we had this experience, and we had it at CAM when we were talking to some folks, that often the collections records say more about the Anglo-American person that collected the item than they do about the Native people who made these items or the materials that these items were made with. And so, you know, we often honor the person who conducted the salvage more than the Native people who this is their cultural heritage. Next slide. So often when we go out, and as professors of Native history, we go out and we talk about Native culture, common response is that we are revisionist and that we're promoting revisionist history. And so in terms of museums looking at decolonization, our museum is about our Native youth programming and giving our Native youth the skills to move forward and revitalize their culture, but also take the culture in the directions that they need to as they go into the future. That's what dynamic cultures are. And so we're not revising history, we're telling people the history that was denied, the history that was erased. And that's really a necessity because of the whole phenomena of trying to blame the victim in genocide. And that really has an impact on Native youth. And so it's not revisionist history, but it is the right thing to do. And when we think about the Native youth that we work with, for them to be able to move forward in a healthy environment, there has to be acknowledgement of not only our history, there also has to be acceptance and support for our authority over our own culture. The next slide. So what does colonization mean? And I know Alexis might want to jump in here, but I think it can mean many things. And there's lots of different ways to decolonize. There's lots of different strategies. There's lots of different approaches based on your institution and how forward thinking they are or not. But I think the critical thing in decolonization is that it's worked out with the tribal communities that you work with, the tribal communities who are in your region, the tribal communities who are connected to your collections. That decolonization has to be defined with them and with them taking the lead. Do you want to add anything to that, Alexis?
Yeah, I guess I would just add from kind of a decolonization 101 standpoint that so that we're on the same page, that we all understand that colonization is an ongoing, still existing process where a group of people in power dominate the land, appropriate the land, and in order of a place that they settle. And in order to do that, oftentimes, almost in every case, they have to kill the people who live there through processes of genocide that Nikki was just talking about. So we're going to get into a number of slides, and this whole talk is about decolonizing museums, and Nikki's absolutely right. That has to be determined with the indigenous communities in and around where your museum is. But that I just want to point out that it's a buzzword right now. You hear it a lot. There's a lot of debates about what decolonization can be. And this slide I created kind of shows a continuum of some of the ideas around what decolonization is. On one end of the spectrum is a group of people who think that decolonization means that the land should be given back by settlers who have benefited from the theft over it and the American genocide that took place. And on the other side of that spectrum is this idea of re-indigenization, where it's almost like if you're a settler descendant, can you try to reconstruct your own histories and your own pasts that aren't tied up, and you have to acknowledge your imbrication in colonization and your part in that it's ongoing, but thinking beyond even that worldview. So yeah, from there we can go on to ways to decolonize museums.
I know I was going to ask you, Jolie, because I know decolonization is not your favorite word. How do you feel about the use of the term as a trend these days?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, it's just, I feel like the word has become kind of the soup du jour, and without a lot of definition. And so I like to see decolonization strategies in action. And so I like to define decolonization in pragmatic, practical terms, how Indigenous peoples today, and in particular Indigenous peoples in California, are maintaining, supporting their own self-determination and sovereignty through their own decolonization strategies, because then decolonization becomes a word, or it's even used to almost shame other people, like you're colonized versus decolonized, right? Another hyphenated term. Or to shame institutions that are trying to make an attempt to incorporate Native voice, Native inclusion, Native ways of knowing. And so I don't want to see our future, our status, our identity left up to one word of the day. And that seems to be, a very popular term. And so that, to me, that's what's critical. Sometimes it's been used as a heavy hammer to shut down certain voices, and then it goes silent. We don't fill it with anything. We don't educate people. We don't provide then alternative resources. So I appreciate Alexis's approach to try to go from one spectrum to another, because there's a lot of in between. And that is why it's so critical when museums are reaching out, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, about some of these strategies and how you decolonize, and place-based learning, how you incorporate voice. But at the same time, we don't want to intimidate anyone or scare them away by immediately using this as a way in which to suppress kind of change or conversation.
Next slide. So it is a really broad term, and it can umbrella a lot of different things. But what does it mean to decolonize a museum narrative? That can mean, looking at your narrative and not talking about Native people in the past. That can mean looking at your collections and realizing that those collections perhaps are hundreds or thousands of miles away from the communities that would benefit from them, and that they should be repatriated. It can mean all kinds of different things. It could mean engaging Native people in your program. But it has impacted so many things in our past and contemporary in terms of our land bases, our resources, you know, our art. We have to go to museums now for our cultural artists to find designs and learn how to make things that are regalia or new forms of art in our community. So looking at it from the term of it's the right thing to do, and now that these collections have been housed and saved, how are they, what is their best use for communities for the future?
And I also think, this is Jolie again, one way to think about it simply as you're approaching exhibits, partnerships, opportunities, is think about it in these terms. Nothing about us without us. So if your institution, organization, museum is going to in any way address Indigenous people, and they all will, even, again, I'll use the example of the Museum of Ice Cream. You can't talk about ice cream until you talk about why the museum was housed there. I think it's in San Francisco, right? So you want to talk about land acknowledgement. You can't talk about land acknowledgement until you include Native voice. So nothing about us without us. And if you think about it in those terms, then it provides you with an outlook of being more inclusive in your approach. And I think that is more inviting. So nothing about us without us would be my phrase of the day, phrase of the future.
I like it. Next slide, please. So decolonizing, how do we make it from symbolic to something that's meaningful? And this is the real critical key, because a lot of museums can say, we're doing a whole process of decolonization, and then you talk to the Native community and they don't know anything about it. And so while there may be good intentions, like Jolie said, it has to happen in partnership and hand in hand with the tribal community. And that means sharing authority, that means having community representation, that means inviting Native people in, and that also means taking criticism. And that might be accepting fault or responsibility for things that happened in the past that you might not have been a part of the museum at that time, but understanding that Native communities and museums have long-term relationships. You know, we're talking about from the time that these things were taken into the collections over the years that they were displayed. And there is, you know, a tribal community memory of things that have occurred in the past. And I remember several years ago working on some regional meetings. I think it was with the Phoebe Hearst Museum. And the community meetings were very intense. And I kept thinking to myself, wow, if we just started this meeting by apologizing, you know, if the museum had apologized to the tribal community, then it might have been easier to move forward. And so I think that we, as institutions, have to accept responsibility for bad deeds or bad acts, even though we weren't necessarily present when they occurred. Next slide. So some of the examples that we've discussed are land acknowledgement, definitely looking at collections and what's in the collection records, are Native people getting access to the collections? And that's a big issue too. You know, a lot of museums only allow tribal representatives into the collections, or tribal representatives have to make the request for collection to see the collections. Well, a lot of times cultural people don't engage in tribal politics, so they might not be represented by those tribal representatives. And so your policies really have to go out and talk to the community and see what's working and not working in order to make sure that they're fair and accessible. What are your strategic plans? Who's on your board? Who's engaged in your development? are you reaching tribal communities? Because we all know that's a challenge. Just engaging on public outreach and communications and reaching the right people, because tribal leadership changes so often, can be a challenge in itself.
So I would add, looking at community-based participatory research, CPBR strategies, they have a number of, there's a lot of literature written on how to engage with communities, how to select partners, because that's the other thing is when I say, you know, nothing about us without us, doesn't mean, you know, tag you're it. I know an Indian and therefore I asked this Indian, so we're good. That's not what we're talking about here. So I think you want to look at CPBR strategies and then create a system, institutionalize a system of protocols, because as your scope changes, as your strategic plan changes, and as your staff changes, you want to institutionalize how you're working with your tribal partners and your American Indian tribal community members. So look at CPBR and then develop a set of protocols.
Kouslaa, could you speak to federally unrecognized tribes and some issues that are faced, for example, with Chumash having so many bands versus one federally recognized, and how institutions engage or don't engage with them?
Perhaps I can. First, though, one thing I wanted to kind of, I've been thinking about as we've been going over the slides, something that's kind of in the background to all of this, in which we, I think, list in the final few slides, is that all of this really does end up costing money. So, and that's okay, right? But just to know that, like, giving or granting, allowing folks access to things that are rightfully kind of from our perspective in some ways, right? Something that they ought to have access to is going to require some degree of kind of potential time, right? On the part of the museum, costs in terms of staffing and so forth. And it's also, the time commitment for folks to do the research that Jolie is talking about, super important, right? Because you don't really want to get it wrong. So I think in terms of adding to what we're talking about here in terms of decolonizing various exhibits and museums, there's a financial commitment. In addition to when you're forming, whether it's a kind of standing committee within your institution, right, you should also be thinking about whether or not you want to have particular committees or boards that are going to be formed for particular collections that may come into your possession. So if it's not from so if you have an opportunity to showcase a collection that is not something that you normally have, and it's from perhaps a tribe that's not local, so you don't have existing relationships with them, you have to build those connections, and you have to reach out and possibly be compensating financially people, members of the community that are spending their time and their expertise to work with you, right? Because, most of us, right, are educators, right? So that's this kind of part of what we do. But for the vast majority of Native people out there that are going to be artists within the community, or who happen to know or have the expertise that you're looking for, they're not going to necessarily be educators, right? They've got their other day job. They need to be compensated for their time. So in thinking through how you decolonize your museum, there are both institutional changes that you have to make, as well as kind of commitments around financial support and so forth, that you have to kind of start thinking about. Land acknowledgements is, I think, a really good example of where a lot of people can do a very, it's almost like, similar to the buzzword of decolonizing. Land acknowledgements has become also a very kind of kitschy, popular thing for folks to do, and it oftentimes lacks a lot of meaning, because it's just a performative example where people come up and say, I acknowledge that this is the Ohlone land, but then in our case, well, exactly which group of Ohlone are you talking about? Or, how are you integrating Ohlone people into the institution itself? Do Ohlone people even know, right? Because there's plenty that are around. Do they even know that your institution is, you know, talking about them, right, or at least attempting to acknowledge them, and then yet they get no kind of actual formal incorporation, right? Can your institution and organization provide and afford conference room space, or any, like, there's all kinds of ways that you could be providing, you know, kind of developing a reciprocal relationship with the tribal communities where you exist. Land acknowledgements is just one example where you can kind of easily get away with checking the box, right? But then not actually have any skin in the game, and be supporting and building that collaborative relationship with the community that you're referring to. So federally versus non-federally recognized tribes, right? I mean, I think collectively in California, we struggled with the canonization issue, right? So whenever it comes to missions, from kind of the lower part of Northern California on down, we have, whether we're federally recognized or not, I think we have kind of some shared grievances around how mission collections particularly have been showcased. So most missions have, right, some Indian artifacts, or whether it be baskets or, you know, things that were taken from tribal communities, right? There's all kinds of things, and there have been attempts to kind of put these forward and showcase them without getting Native folks involved. So this has been, you know, we have particular struggles with missions because we don't have formal representation within them. And there is no kind of, there has been no reconciliation process put in place with the missions, which has, you know, further hindered this kind of potential for collaboration. So, you know, you could do it from one mission, you know, to the local community, which again, when it comes to missions, it gets complicated because tribes were moved around from mission to mission, right? Tribal communities, individuals. So it gets really complicated. You really need to do it through a system-wide approach, which is going to be regardless of whether a tribe is federally recognized or not, right? I live in currently in the Monterey Peninsula. One of the issues that the local tribe here has is with the city, right, still digging up digging into land that we know has artifacts, right? So the tribe is constantly trying to make sure that it can have a voice and have a say. Well, sometimes museum folks will come out and support the tribes, and other times they'll be doing the exact opposite, right? They'll have their archaeologists or their anthropologists or whoever they collaborate with arguing in support of extraction or desecration of sites. So you really have to kind of make sure you're working with people that are in support of advocating for tribes, whether federally recognized or not, because oftentimes we don't have a seat at the table and you're the access point, right? You're the person that can support, you're the person that can help facilitate that relationship. So wherever you are, whether you know there's a federally recognized tribe or not, there's going to be a Native population that is ancestral to that territory. Some of them may live in a different county at this point. That's usually a function of history, right? Not preference. So you have to find them, you have to search them out. And that can be difficult, but it's part of the commitment to decolonizing your museum.
I think it's important to, you know, to think about the bigger picture. I often hear museums say, well, there's so many tribes, I don't know which one I'm supposed to work with. And the answer is, you're supposed to work with all of them. You can't just think about working with one. And wouldn't it be convenient if you only had to work with one? Well, there's 200 tribes in California. So, you know, most of the time you're going to be working within a region. And beyond that, I know that, you know, when it comes to government relationship and cities and museums looking to work with a tribe who's in their region, they have to think bigger, because there may be one single tribe in their region, but there's a whole community of Native American people in that area that have lived there for a long time as well. And so it can't just be about a single tribe, it has to be about the tribal community. Next slide, please. How can decolonization be accomplished? There's lots of different ways. These are just some examples of ways that we've seen museums have success. And definitely oral history and having Native perspectives integrated into museum narratives is critical. And that speaks to, you know, one of our big complaints about being pinpointed in the past, when you can show the continuity of oral tradition and cultural revitalization that's happening now. It's, I think, critical to showcase because we're still here. Addressing the legacy of colonialism, taking out the loaded terms. You know, my favorite pet peeves are Indians wandered to the missions. Nobody wandered when you've lived there since time immemorial. You know, those types of colonial terms, and we'll talk about how you analyze bias and realize that some of these terms served a purpose. Looking at cultural value and significance to tribal communities. The trend in legislation now, especially when it comes to NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA, is not only to participate with the federally unrecognized tribes, the 77 that's on the Native American Heritage List, but it's also to give more weight to cultural traditional knowledge over anthropological and archaeological knowledge when it comes to NAGPRA. So if we're going to look at where things are moving towards in the future, it would be good that if museums were aligned with how things are dealt on the state level. Museum staffing definitely helps. You know, we often look at museums and we see our objects there, but we don't see a reflection of our communities in those museums. So when you have Native Americans on staff, and there's lots of Native American museum professionals, it's definitely going to work better towards community engagement. Your community programming, who is it for? We work towards a lot of partnerships in our museum, but there's a certain time where the partnership can turn into cultural appropriation. And we have to set very particular ground rules with, you know, they call it allies. Often they use the term allies. But with our partners to establish what the boundaries are. You know, if we work with you and you're learning from our cultural expert how to process acorns, we definitely don't want to see an institution 3 weeks later having a class and charging $70 for non-Indian people to come in and learn how to process acorns. You know, those types of things. So the more that we share, we often still have to have concern about how this information will be used. And we have a responsibility to abide by our cultural protocols, and we ask that people respect that in return.
And that's where that list of protocols can come into play to remind people. So for example, if you have a collaborative partnership with individuals, with an organization, with the tribal community, or an advisory board, that before any type of publication, presentation, new exhibit is put forward, that a conversation is had. And I know as a professor, there have been some faculty in different institutions that I have worked with, whether they were linguistics folks or historians, that said, oh, I don't want to work with tribes, or I don't want to work on that grant because I can't be told what, where and when and what I can publish. I said, okay, but you want to take from those communities their cultural knowledge and their information, but you don't want to grant them the respect to say, look, I'm interested in publishing in this journal article or presenting it. And if people feel that that is too much for them, then they're not the people that should be partnering or collaborating with tribal communities. And so developing a system and a set of protocols that really clearly explain that will save you a lot of frustration down the road.
Also important to think about building trust over time. And I think that's really critical because the communities that you work with will all be in different stages. Tribes across California have varying levels of infrastructure. You know, you might be working with a tribal council who had a bad experience with the museum, but you know, and 5 years later, it's a different tribal council. Or maybe the community has, you know, put a anthropologist through school, and now they have a tribal anthropologist in their community who can now work as a liaison between the community and the institution. So thinking about, you know, committing yourself to building that trust over time, and understanding that that, you know, people might not be ready for a full-blown partnership right away, but also considering the evidence and the what has happened throughout our history. It's perfectly natural to want to take baby steps and make sure that the institution is proving that they're worthy of a partnership. In addition to the next slide. So it's important to consider historical trauma, and we don't use historical trauma. I've heard some criticism that we don't want to present ourselves as victims, and that's not why we're talking about historical trauma. It's the exact opposite. We're pretty strong people to have got through the past. You know, our ancestors were pretty badass, let's say, in order to survive the things that occurred. And so our historical trauma is not about holding on to the past. It's about what the past's impact is on us currently. And there's a lot of science behind looking at historical trauma and its impact on the physical and psychological. Next slide. So what is it? It's a collective and emotional psychological injury over the lifespan and across generations from a cataclysmic history of genocide. And when you think about California, our genocide didn't happen that long ago. You know, we're talking 3, maybe 4 generations at most. So it's not something that we feel distanced from. It feels very close and real. Next slide. It's important for institutions to realize that historical trauma has an impact on tribal communities and individuals. And, you know, we can talk about the struggles we've had. You know, we all have kids. We all have Native American kids, and there's nothing like triggering a Native American mom when she finds out that her kid was sitting in the 4th grade and told that she was a savage, right? Or that she was a heathen. It's very traumatizing, not just because you feel it yourself, but to recognize that you haven't been able to shield your child from that. And so it's very difficult, and we have to work through our internal struggle of overcoming those triggers in order to educate the people sitting in front of us that need to be educated, because often it brings a lot of emotion and anger that we see within ourselves.
Nikki, can I add something to that?
Sure.
Yeah, I think at least personally for me, it really manifests in a kind of resentment. When in, for example, a museum context, if you go to a museum as a Native person and you see objects that may have come from your community or communities that you're familiar with, and you know that you can't get access to these or other folks can't get access to them in the community, but somehow this museum has this collection, right? And if it's on loan from someone or from a private collection, it's really the only opportunity you may have a chance to view it. And it feels like something was stolen, right? And it feels like a part of your community is missing and has been taken, and you can see it, but you can't touch it, right? It can't ever be reclaimed in some way. So if you know, when you engage with these communities and you're like, oh, look, don't you want to check out what we have, right? We've got this stuff that looks like it's from you or from your community. And then there's no commitment to returning that or to making, you know, to meeting the demands of the community that you're working with. Don't be surprised if people are upset, right? And that dynamic plays into the relationship that takes place. So it's something that we are. It's not our problem, right? It's a problem that's embedded in the history, and you may be walking into it if you don't know what you have or what that history is, right?
I think too, just as much as we need teacher training throughout the state of California, we need docent training. And docents have to recognize the impact that they can have on Native American children who go through their collections. My daughter's corrected docents many times, and docents don't always like to be told they're wrong in front of 39-year-olds. And so, that creates a tense relationship as well. I remember one time we were in a recreated Pomo village on a land preserve, and the docent came and put what we call a burden basket around her neck and was sitting on the floor with the kids with the burden basket hanging across her chest. And she asked, "What kind of basket is this?" And my daughter said, "That's a burden basket." And the docent said, "No, it's not. It's a baby basket." And she took a doll and put the doll in the cone-shaped burden basket. And I just laughed to myself because I thought, well, you've never held a Pomo baby. It'd be pretty hard to hold them around your neck. But these are the types of things that we run into all the time, and it makes it difficult because we're educating our kids about their culture and history, and then they go out into their school and into museums, and they get told things that are opposite or untrue, and it becomes frustrating. Next slide. These are some just resources on historical trauma, but you can see the variety of impacts that it has on the psychological, looking at, when we look at Native American graduation rates and success rates and issues that we have with tribal youth, we're often looking at mental health, depression, substance abuse, and things that occur as a result of historical trauma. Next slide. And then there's the physical impacts. There's a study now looking at what's called epigenetics and how historical trauma turns on certain light bulbs in your DNA that welcomes things like cancer and heart disease and diabetes and low immune systems. And so, we're just scratching the surface on historical trauma, but there are a lot of different consequences that we face every day as a result of it. And so I think it's important for institutions to realize that in addition to the cultural rights we're fighting for, we're also fighting for, basic health, and whether that be mental and physical. Next slide. Symptoms of historical trauma and examples of historical events, looking at obsessive compulsive disorders, anxiety, depression, hypervigilance. These are all things that are very common that we face in tribal communities. Next slide. How does it impact tribal youth? Definitely looking at how it impacts their ability to succeed, but I think when you think about Native youth and going through the education process, and when they look at general youth delinquency, they often connect it to the number of negative events that have occurred along a child's lifetime. Well, if we start looking at tribal youth and the negative events that happen with them by the time they hit kindergarten, they're going to have negative events when they learn about Columbus in kindergarten. They're going to have negative events when they learn about the gold rush and missionization in 4th grade. Then they're going to go to high school, and then they're going to have U.S. history, and they're going to learn more misinformation and stereotypes. And so these things build up over time and contribute to their sense of marginalization and not seeing themselves represented in the education system. These are just some statistics on looking at Native youth and historical trauma and experiences. But it's important that we have that voice, because we are often less than 1% of the student body. So Native youth, you know, when we live on the edge of the urban sprawl, are typically only one of a handful of Native youth in a school, and they don't often have the support that speaks up for them. When we look at the lessons on California Indian history, you know, we can have another webinar on for a couple more hours on things we need to change there. So they're confronted with bias along their educational journey. And if museums are institutions that are forward thinking and trying to offer enhanced educational experiences, it's our responsibility to eliminate that bias from our programs and our narratives.
And it's important to remember that historical trauma is anything that happened like 5 minutes ago. So it's not, I don't want you to think about it in terms of just the gold rush or when Europeans first came ashore to the California coast. It happens constantly, and museums should not be the perpetrators of that. And it's not just by the act of you know, putting culturally insensitive exhibits together. It's also the act of not doing anything. It's very painful to go into a facility that is highlighting, let's say, the environment or knowledge systems and forest management, and not to see Native voice or perspective in there. And so on the flip side to what our children face and what just average community members learn, think of what you can do as a museum to inspire and to be inclusive by creating an exhibit with community partners. So it's a political act to do nothing, but it's also a political act to do something. And you have to look at your museum's mission statement, what it stands for, and what you're trying to do: educate, you know, create a sense of community engagement or belonging, elevate knowledge around whatever it is that your museum is promoting. But you really need to think about who's in your community, and because of the very nature of where you are, there should always be an inclusion of Native peoples and Native voice. Otherwise, the act of erasure is a very harmful and violent act, a contemporary act of historical trauma.
Next slide. I have some more resources, and you can click on the oral traditions in the slide, and it should take you to some additional resources. Next slide. And then it's really critical too that when we talk about historical trauma, we talk about resiliency, and you know, the idea that we have generations who have survived these events, but we still have our language, we still have our cultural traditions. Those things are being taught to our children. So, you know, the message of resiliency and strength is definitely what we want our kids to walk away from when they learn about these events in our history. Next slide.
So I think that some of our speakers have already spoken to this, but as a recap, what you've inherited by way of your chosen profession in the museum field is this legacy of colonization and the intergenerational and ongoing trauma that accompanies it. So if we want you to, a takeaway from this would be to be empathetic to these experiences when you're engaging local community members in practical hands-on efforts to decolonize your museum, and that you have a responsibility to your audience. So I just wanted to very briefly give a little bit of historical perspective to where museums came from. As you probably know, they started as a way of showcasing the spoils, things taken from other places during the age of exploration, leading up to a long period of colonization, from generally the global north to the global south, the west to the east, for private collectors, kings, their friends. And then in the 17 and 1800s, then we see the advent of nationalized museums that become symbols of newly formed nation states in an effort to create a unified identity and agreement among the public. And in the US, the public mostly meant white males or well-to-do white men and women who all agree on our national myths. So all of these objects that were stolen from indigenous peoples were really upheld by these false narratives that are hurtful to indigenous peoples who are still here. But now, in the last 20, 30 years, we've really been moving into more of a community-driven museum model that reflects a much broader set of audiences that are very diverse and intersectional, like our kids in our schools. So we want those kids in our schools to be reflected in a way that is true of their ancestry and their past, and not just a made-up national myth about American exceptionalism or go west young man, or that Native people are dead and don't exist. So we really want to think about this whole discussion today is about taking an active role in that movement. Next slide.
This just speaks to the importance of doing, and this is another term Dr. Proudfit doesn't like, cultural sensitivity, but she reminds me that it's not about being sensitive or feeling bad for us, but it's about speaking intelligently. And so it's really important that we look and examine our perspectives that are the legacy of cultural narratives. And that has a lot to do with stereotypes and microaggressions. This is a map of the 144 schools in California that still have Native American mascots. But, you know, when we're having these conversations, these are very common microaggressions that we hear. You know, recently I think I spent about 45 minutes talking to a small group about genocide, and the question I got after the discussion was, okay, yeah, but what do we call you? And I know that that's well intended, that you don't want to get off on the wrong foot, but it's also very minimizing when you've just learned about genocide for 45 minutes. To me, I'm Pomo, really. You know, our ancestry is the only accurate identification. But, you know, these are the types of things. And, you know, someone recently said, well, I want to work with the community. So, you know, we just want to pass the peace pipe. And and she caught herself and she said, is that okay? And I said, let's just stick with the olive branch. You know, you don't need to go there. So we really want to make sure that people become aware of some of the things, and these microaggressions are often just part of our fabric of society, and many people don't even realize how derogatory they are, just because it seems like natural communication, and so we have to examine that. Next slide.
Another word I don't like, microaggressions. It's all aggressions. And I think, but truly, I mean, I make jokes about things, but microaggressions has been used to basically minimize and marginalize American Indians more than any other group of people. Oh, well, it's not as bad as the N-word. Or, well, at least you guys have casinos. Well, you have long hair. You know, I mean, it's just like, what? That completely minimizes the assault and the attack of whatever it is, stereotypes, erasure, you know, ignorance. So even the term microaggression, it's frequently used to minimize the effect of change on our emotions intended towards a particular population, and in this case, American Indians.
It's also important to analyze historical bias. And what I'll say shortly about this is that when we look at primary sources on history, we have to think about the purpose of why those were written. And you can go back and look in Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny. But when they came here, they were trying to prove that we were savage and uncivilized in order to take our land and our resources. And so in anything that was written about us, you know, there are things about us being ugly, or, you know, not intelligent. They were written for a purpose, and now these have become the records of history. And so we really got to take another look at what we're using. You know, we did a website on the missions, and even though I had a full Native staff working on that website, we really had to comb through because the historical bias still finds its way into the context of any discussion of the missions. So it's really critical. Next slide. I was talking with my mute on. There's lots of resources that are available. There's lots of training, professional development, websites. There's a lot out there on traditional ecological knowledge and native science. I really like the Chumash Science Through Time. The National Museum of the American Indian has some great curriculum. And then there's also the online collection sharing. And I think that that's something also worth a discussion, probably a more in-depth discussion than we have time for. But it's important to realize that a lot of cultural protocols, you know, don't even allow viewing of objects, let alone putting them online. And so when we put things online, there's lots of issues around intellectual property, around cultural intelligence, you know, and also my big pet peeve is that digital sharing is not instead of repatriation. You know, objects belong back in the communities with the people that share the heritage and will benefit from. There's a great example. The National Museum of the American has the largest pomo basket in the world. It was worked on by 11 weavers. It's absolutely beautiful. And it sits on a shelf in Suitland, Maryland, with a plastic cover over it, and has for several decades. I don't know if it's ever come back to California since it was sold in the early 1900s. Now, that is one of the most inspiring baskets that I've ever seen. It belongs in Pomo country, where Pomo youth can see that object and be proud and be inspired by it. And so we'll bring it home someday. Next slide. Is this Alexis?
So I think it's kind of, it's Alexis's, and I was going to say a couple of things about it. Was that right? Something like this? Yeah, so noting that it is 1 o'clock, and I know that some folks will start falling off, just know that this, will be put up online. And so you don't have to take copious notes now. All of the slides will be there for your reference in the future. But some of the things that you can do, right, there are really simple things, but then also kind of much more complex things to start the decolonization process. The first one, right, is just in thinking about how you talk, right? Just basic conversations you have with folks. And one of them is you may already have resources that you are not even aware of. Like folks in your organizations may all be Native people that are working in the field that want to participate and are interested in helping you decolonize. So just be aware that there are people always and everywhere around you that are Native and that may have already been working in this area or arena. So tap into your networks, but also be aware that people are stretched thin in terms of their time and commitment. So you have to be very respectful about who you're asking to participate in terms of how you're asking them, what types of accommodations you can make for them, especially when you're thinking about forming advisory boards or institutionally based organizations. It kind of returns us back to the initial comments that Nikki made around working with the communities, right? You have to work with both the communities that may be in your region, but also the ones that are related to the collections that you hold, right? So it's not just a geographically bound relationship that you're building. Native advisory boards are only so useful as you make use of them, right? Like you have to engage them in the planning, the process, the rollout, etc. You're not always going to hear what you want to about, you know, the collection that you may have. If it's a private collection seeking to kind of put out spiritually significant items, right? And the tribe objects, or the relevant stakeholders object, you have to be willing, and if you're actually going to do this, right, to pull, right, the collection and possibly repatriate it back, right? There's a range of commitments that you can make, but don't just have their names listed for posterity. You actually have to listen to them, right? So this also is around protocol for how to handle objects. It's going to be different from what your standard processes may be. There may need to be ceremonies around particular objects that you may have, right? There's all kinds of things that you don't know that you need to know. And the only way to know those things is to rope people in, right? The experts in. Again, being respectful of their time and so forth. Next slide. So again, Indigenous land acknowledgement in the chat box. Nikki has already provided you with a kind of Honor Native Land Acknowledgement Guide that you can look at and view. It's kind of how to go about best practices for doing land acknowledgements. That can be a very useful resource. A lot of universities have also engaged in this kind of practice, and there are some kind of bad and good ways to go about it. So Professor Proudfit has a really exceptional kind of example, I think, on her California State San Marcos website. You can take a look there and reach out to her to get to know more about that. Right, so your board of directors should definitely have lots of representation from people of color, right? Not just necessarily Native people. Native people are essential to this, but in general, you want folks that are all kind of coming from different marginalized community perspectives to be able to contribute to challenging and engaging and so forth, even when a Native person is not necessarily in the room, right? Asking for, pursuing free prior informed consent, which I think we haven't yet talked about, but that is to say, right, you need to be asking before you're planning on, like, don't be in process about to open an exhibit and then decide you need to contact the tribe and ask them if they want to have a special viewing, right? Like, that is way too late. It should have happened before, from the very beginning, when you initially even thought you had a collection that was going to be opened up, or had someone ask you if you wanted to show their collection, right? That's when you should be starting that process if you don't already have a standing advisory board. Let's see, right, so the other things I've mentioned as well previously, the overtaxing of leadership, the compensation, so on and so forth, right? So it's a for those of us who have worked with museum folks, and I have done so in my capacity at school, it is a humbling experience, right? And we all make mistakes, and it can be a growing process. You don't know what you don't know until you're in the middle of it. So be careful about how you do it. That's why we're having this conversation, right? Is to share with you some of the things that we've learned, and to kind of help you know the right questions to ask and know how to slow down when you need to, and don't move forward until you are ready. And by being ready, I mean basic things. Don't divorce objects from the communities, right? Or the subjects that we're talking about. There's a lot that you can do now to be ready to showcase Native collections, but you remember, you're not doing it alone, right? You're talking about a community.
So we are over time, so I'm going to just finish us out with about 1 more minute, and if people want to stay on and have questions, we can answer them. I am pasting a link at the bottom of the chat box, and this next 2 slides is from an article that was recently published by UNESCO that I wrote, and it's just it's not totally inclusive. It's just a set of recommendations for things that museums around the world can do to make their collections more equitable and to manage them in a way that is responsive to the communities from which those objects came. And so one of those things is study the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that has been ratified now by all Anglo-settler colonial nations, some of us later than others. Incorporate the communities of descendants or living peoples from whom that objects may have been collected in the past or in the present, incorporate their recommendations, put them on staff, practice truth and reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation is, again, one of those buzzwords. And to be completely in candor, there are people who believe reconciliation cannot happen given the truth to history, but we can still acknowledge why we have collections and try to handle them in a more respectful, equitable way, and even give them back if that's the right thing to do. So next slide, please. And I think we've said this one a lot, make an effort to understand the cultural protocols of the communities from which objects come from, and to respect cultural values of the communities from whom objects come from. And here you can see I've written source communities, but I don't even really like that terminology, like there's a source of something and you've collected it. We need to decolonize our terminology as well and constantly make it an ongoing process. And last one, to reach out. If you don't try and reach out and don't make the effort, it's not going to happen. And like Kouslaa said earlier, it's going to take time, it's going to be expensive, but it's the right thing to do. And if we prioritize it, it will happen. Last slide.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. I know we run out of time like we always do because we try to give you as much information as possible. But we did put our emails in the introduction slide, and so consider us here as a resource, and we'd be happy to answer any questions in the chat box or through email. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to the panel.
Nikki, I've been looking at the list of participants to see if anybody has raised their hand, and I haven't seen anything yet. And I think, thank you for those resources, Alexis. And if anybody has any questions, we encourage you now to put that in the chat box or raise your hand. I think maybe everybody's satisfied with the presentation as is. So thank you. Thank you very much, Nikki. Thank you for the team, to Alexis, Kouslaa, and Professor Proudfit. Thank you very much for your time and for being our teachers and your willingness to share your knowledge and experience with us. I sincerely hope and I believe that you have inspired museum professionals to really think about the role that they can play in the decolonization of their organizations, as well as just how to be more sensitive and more compassionate in approaching their work. So thank you very much for your time. I do very quickly want to give kind of a shout out to next year's conference, which will be in Los Angeles. The dates are March 4th through the 6th, 2020. And I did hear that perhaps there might be a part 2 to this session. So you can go to our website if you have any, would like more information about the 2020 conference. We are in the process right now of determining what the sessions and programs will be, and we'll be announcing that this fall. So thank you very much for your time, everybody, for participating, for being presenters, very much appreciated. And I also want to mention that if you are just watching this on YouTube afterwards, that the resources and the links that were in the chat should be in the description of the YouTube video. So you should be able to access the same materials that those who participated in the presentation today had access to. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.